Hey everybody, this is a section from Class Struggles in the USSR, third period, 1930 to 1941, part 1, The Dominated by Charles Bettelheim. The chapter this section is from is chapter 2 of part 2 of the book. Part 2 of the book is titled The Militarized Working Class, and Chapter 2 of Part 2 is titled Extension of the Wage-Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. Section 4, which is the section I'm reading today, is titled Transformation of the Wage and Norm-Fixing Principles and Some Effects of this Transformation. Give me a second to set up here. Gotta get to the end notes. God, I hate end notes. Footnotes all day, baby. Okay. Let's rock. Section 4. Transformation of the wage and norm-fixing principles and some effects of this transformation. Throughout NEP, it had been acknowledged that the development of production and the raising of the technical level of industry would have to be accompanied by a progressive leveling of wages. This principle was still accepted by the 7th and 8th trade union congresses. In 1929, after the elimination of the union leaders following the 8th Congress, this principle of progressive wage leveling, inherited from the revolutionary ideology of 1917, was increasingly rejected. An opposite principle triumphed, that of, quote, struggle against leveling, end quote. New section, Section A, the, quote, struggle against leveling, end quote. The most systematic formulation of this question may be found in Stalin's words to a conference of industrial managers in June 23, 1931. This speech, which at the same time was often referred to as enunciating, quote, the 6 new conditions, end quote, of socialist construction, included a violent attack against the, quote, leftist, end quote, quote, the, quote, leftist, end quote, practice of wage equalization, end quote, and insisted on the need for wage differentiation. Stalin criticized the, quote, egalitarians, end quote, who ignored, quote, the difference between skilled and unskilled work, end quote. Stalin emphasized, quote, personal responsibility, end quote, in production and the need for, quote, incentives for increasing the productivity of labor, end quote. Stalin also insisted on the necessity of profitability and a growth of accumulation within industry. In the following years, enterprise managers and union cadres strove to put these principles into practice. They sought to use them as means of combating the fast rise of cost, which characterized, despite the introduction of modern production techniques, 1931 and 1932. At the 9th Congress of Trade Unions, April 1932, Schwernick declared, quote, The 6 conditions of Comrade Stalin constitute the militant program of the Union movement. Zvernik affirmed that the maximum introduction of piece rates on the basis of technical production norms is the most important Union task, end quote. Zvernik. And if you aren't listening along to this like I was, as if I was, what was I saying? Aren't listening along to all these videos, or kind of listening to them in bursts, which is what I would recommend, actually. Zvernik was the head of the Bureau of Trade Unions, or whatever you call it, after Tomsky was removed. At least I'm pretty sure that's what I remember. Maybe I'm making that up, but peace rates thus ceased to be officially regarded as a temporary measure. Peace rates were put forward as inherently socialist. As for the formulations of Marx declaring that, quote, peace wage is the form of wage most in harmony with the capitalist mode of production, end quote, this was not mentioned. See Marx Capital Volume 1. Nevertheless, for those who acknowledge these formulations, the generalization of peace rates reveals the extension of capitalist relationships in the 1930s. Wage differentiation was extolled both as a means of increasing production and of encouraging the formation of technical cadres. For example, receiving a delegation of metallurgists on December 26, 1934, Stalin enunciated the formula, quote, it is necessary to organize wages so as to strengthen the decisive links of production and to impel people towards higher qualifications. That is what we must do in order to create a numerous army of technical cadres for production, end quote. Stalin. Differentiation of wages in accordance with, quote, qualifications, end quote, and industries were also highly revealing of the predominant type of social relationships. It portrayed the labor force. The labor force is operating in effect as a commodity whose current price depended on its reproduction cost and was influenced by supply and demand. The differentiation of wages in accordance with, quote, qualifications and industries portrayed the labor force as operating in effect as a commodity whose current price depended on the labor force's reproduction cost and was influenced by supply and demand. The struggle of the party against, quote, leveling, end quote, was part of a total perspective. The struggle of the party against, quote, leveling aimed at a differentiation of workers' wages and at the growth of the gap between the wages of immediate producers and those of enterprise managers, engineers, technicians, and administrators. The struggle of the party against, quote, leveling was part of a total perspective. The struggle of the party against, quote, leveling aimed at a differentiation of workers' wages and at the growth of the gap between the wages of immediate producers and those of enterprise managers, engineers, technicians, and administrators. It will be seen what effects this struggle had on the real differentiation of wages and on the general picture of social relationships. From 1931, the, quote, struggle against leveling was tightly bound up with an effort aimed at raising production norms assigned to workers, which were indeed raised several times. But the question of norms revision was especially conspicuous during the second five-year plan. New section, Section B, the upward revision of production norms. From the beginning of the first five-year plan, the party leadership put considerable pressure on all cadres to persuade those cadres to obtain an increase in labor's output, by means of increasing its intensity and productivity. It was not simply a question of increasing production, but also of reducing production cost and improving enterprise profitability. The pressure thus imposed led many enterprise managers to increase production norms by 10 or 28%, which had the effect of reducing the wages of those workers who failed to increase their output in accordance with the increased norms applicable to them. Such norm increases occurred from 1929 to 1930. Enterprise managements which followed this course justified themselves by reference to the higher output obtained by shock workers (udarniki), taking part in socialist competition. In 1931 and 1932, the raising of norms continued. The party and the managing economic organizations tried in this way to compensate increased prime costs by a lowering of wage costs. The prime cost being connected with the entry into production of a mass of inexperienced workers and to the disorganization of enterprises and construction sites resulting from the exaggerated scale of the tasks assigned to them. There are two footnotes here. Footnote, this differentiation was part of a policy of dividing the working class, bracket, a subject to which we shall return, end bracket, and of constituting a worker minority that was relatively, quote, privileged, end quote. The existence of this latter gave to the power of the dominant class a particular social base. It permitted the practice of a, quote, workerism, end quote, of a specific type. There's an article by a Soviet scholar called Stalin's anti-worker workerism, or something like that. Anyway, end footnote. Footnote, the cost increases in 1931 and 1932, especially in construction, is from A. Zaleski's analyses in Planification. The author writes that in 1931, construction cost increased 17%, whereas the plan anticipated a decrease of 15%. End footnote. A certain resistance to increased norms then made itself felt. It appeared not only in the working class, but also in various organs entrusted up to then with establishing production norms, for they wanted to take into account the effects of these increased norms on workers' health. This resistance was severely condemned by the party leadership and the party leadership's ideologists, especially after spring of 1931. In April 1931, the, quote, fatigue theory, end quote, was criticized in the name of, quote, a Marxist-Leninist conception of the physiology of work, end quote. For example, S. Kaplan, the chief of the Institute of Worker Protection, lashed out at the physiologists who, according to him, seriously overestimated the, quote, subjective feeling of fatigue, end quote. This is fascinating shit right here. S. Kaplan claimed that this, quote, subjective factor, end quote, could be overcome by an effort of will, and that work continued in spite of fatigue was not bad for the worker's health. S. Kaplan did not hesitate to describe as, quote, class enemies, end quote, those who defended a contrary opinion. S. Kaplan wrote in particular, quote, the activization of hostile elements among a sector of scientists reflects the class enemy's bitter resistance to the socialist offensive of the proletariat. Decisively beaten all along the economic front, the class enemy thinks he can hold the last trench line. On a few sectors of the ideological front, there need be no doubt that he will be crushed in this, his final position. Footnote: S. Kaplan, quoted from Schwartz. Schwartz being one of the most esteemed, Solomon Schwartz being one of the most esteemed theorists of, or not theorists, but historians of labor in the Soviet Union. One second, I want to copy this quote down. Where am I? Come on. Back to the text. Such formulations are typical of the recourse to a, quote, proletarian ideology, end quote, constructed of all kinds of ingredients to defend the policy of work intensification and growth of exploitation to which the workers are subjected. These formulations were in preparation for the new campaign that was conducted for the raising of work norms. Thus, on the occasion of the 14th anniversary of the October Revolution, the Journal of Heavy Industry of the Heavy Industry Commissariat declared, quote, Bolshevism must enter into scientific and technical calculations as a new category, overturning all previous views of the bases of such calculations, end quote. Quoted in Schwartz. These standpoints began a rupture that was progressively more complete, and the previous practices for fixing production norms, practices which had tried to keep in mind the need for an inactive time during the working day so as to avoid an excessive intensification of work. It was in these conditions that new partial revisions of production norms appeared in 1932 and 1933. However, the quest for increased industrial profits required to cope with ever higher investment led the party to demand in a resolution adopted in 1934 by the 17th Congress a reorganization of the wage system, and then at the beginning of 1935 a substantial upward revision of production norms. Footnote. The growth of investment had in fact as a consequence the circumstance that only a relatively small part of it was covered by the profits of enterprises. Thus in 1935 the private volume of the state sector rose to 7.8 billion rubles, whereas investment in the, quote, socialized economy, end quote, was 22.7 billion. Bracket C. Charles Bettelheim, La Planification Soviétique. Page 268, end bracket. End footnote. The Stakhanovite movement, which began with the record output on August 31st, 1935 by the miner Alexei Stakhanov, made it possible to proceed to new and large upward revisions of the norms. These revisions were obtained by steering clear of the outputs obtained by average workers, for the records of the Stakhanovites became one of the factors taken into account in establishing new production norms. Thus was abandoned the principle more or less accepted until then, by which the output of the average worker was one of the main bases for the calculation of production norms. The establishment of norms fixed in these new conditions was demanded by Stalin in a speech he made on November 17, 1935, at a conference of Stakhanovites. In this speech, Stalin gave a definition of the Stakhanovite movement by declaring that it should open the way to an upward revision of the production and productivity plans. Stalin advanced the following formulations. Quote, "The Stakhanovite movement is a movement of male and female workers who set themselves the target of exceeding the existing technical norms, of exceeding the forecast output capacities, of exceeding the current plans of production and balances, ... This movement overthrows the old way of regarding technique. It overthrows the old technical norms, the old forecast output capacities, ... It demands new, higher technical norms, output capacities, production plans. It has been summoned to make a revolution in our industry." End quote. Stalin. After affirming that, quote, "male and female workers," end quote, bracket, by which must be understood Stakhanovites, end parenthesis, had already rejected old technical norms, Stalin contrasted the Stakhanovites with workers who wanted to hold on to the old norms, whom Stalin described as, quote, "retarded masses," end quote. Stalin. But Stalin recognized that there was resistance among workers by indicating that, quote, "certain workers have attacked Stakhanov for his innovations," end quote. Footnote. We shall see later more about the resistance of the workers to Stakhanovism and how the resistance of workers to Stakhanovism was used. I misread that. We shall see later more about the resistance of the workers to Stakhanovism and how it was used to increase work intensity. End footnote. Finally, Stalin demanded that new norms be adopted that took account of the production, quote, records, end quote, without being totally aligned with them. At the beginning of 1936, the work norms were substantially increased. Simultaneously, some piecework wage rates were reduced. Footnote, see Alec Nova's An Economic History of the Soviet Union, page 233. At the same time, the Central Institute of Labor, parenthesis, which customarily checked the compatibility of norms with workers' health, end parenthesis, was abolished. The Central Institute of Labor had put up some opposition to these revisions. See Izvestia, April 2nd, 1936. And footnote. In 1937 to 38, the production norms were again increased. A growing number of workers were not able to fulfill the minimal norm that had been imposed and thereby lost part of their wages. In 1938, 60% of metallurgical workers could not reach their norms. The same applied to 1940 for 22 to 32% of workers in all industries. End footnote. Footnote, not end footnotes, footnote. See A. Yugov's book, Russia's Economic Front for War and Peace, published in 1942. See also Schwernick, Intrude, April 17th, 1941. End footnote. It should be emphasized that during the 1930s, and especially after 1936, the number of norms was multiplied. For example, in 1939, in the Machine and Vehicle Construction Commissariat alone, there were 2,026,000 norms. Footnote. See Maschinensteuer, April 11th, 1939, quoted by Tony Cliff in Russia, a Marxist Analysis. End footnote. At the end of the 1930s, more than 75% of wage earners were on piece rates, parenthesis, of whom about 3/7 received a progressive piece wage, end parenthesis. About 10% received a wage with bonuses, only a minority on a simple time rate. Only a minority were on a simple time rate. Footnote. Progressive piece rates gave way to basic piece wage for an output within the norm. Once the norm was reached, each unit of output was remunerated at a rate that was much higher. For example, for a worker who overfulfilled that worker's norm, the units corresponding to the 5% above norm output could be paid at 1.5 times the usual rate. Beyond 5%, the rate was double, and beyond 10%, it was triple. This example is quoted from N.S. Maslova, Der Arbeitslohn, published in Berlin in 1953, a translation from a book of the same title in Russian. Bracket Moscow, 1952, end bracket. This writer recalls that, quote, the progressive piece rate is applied correctly only when it permits a reduction of production costs, end quote. Bracket, page 43 and page 48, end bracket. End footnote. New section, section C, wage differentiation and the, quote, economic atomization, end quote, of the workers. The struggle against the alleged, quote, left equalization, end quote, quote, leftist equalization, end quote, of wages, and the multiplication of norms and other ways of calculating the receipts of the workers led to an increased differentiation in the working class's living conditions and to a, quote, economic atomization, end quote, of that class. The starting point of this change was the growing extension of wage categories. Whilst by virtue of decisions taken in 1928, there were 8 categories for workers' wages, the number of these scales was sometimes increased during the 1930s to 11, parenthesis, for example, in the mines and metallurgy, end parenthesis. See Solomon Schwartz, page 147. The complexity of the system was increased by the existence of 3 distinct wage scales, according to whether it was a matter of piecework within mass production, piecework outside mass production, or hourly work. The difference in reality between workers' wages were increased still more by the existence of different basic wages according to industries, localities, and enterprises. The differences in reality between workers' wages were increased still more by the existence of different basic wages according to industries, localities, and enterprises. In fact, each year the government and the central economic organs fixed the amount, in money terms, by hour or by day, of the wage corresponding to the first scale for each enterprise. They fix at the same time the maximum amount of wages the enterprise is allowed to pay out. In practice, it is impossible to calculate the maximum coefficient of inequality, but it was certainly much more than 10 in 1936 at the level of the average extreme. Obviously, it was greater at the level of individual wages. One example illustrates the size of wage differentials towards the middle of the second five-year plan, at a time when the Stakhanovite movement was having its first effects. The differentials between the extremes of pay for workers belonging to different industries were obviously greater. The differentials between the extremes of pay for workers belonging to different industries are obviously greater. In fact, in 1936, about 2 or 3 million workers received less than 100 rubles per month. In fact, in 1936, about 2 or 3 million workers received less than 100 rubles per month, while Stakhanovites of the Kaganovich factory in Moscow received several hundred rubles per month, up to 1,800 rubles. Footnote. This emerges from the decree of November 1st, 1937, published in Izvestia, November 2nd, 1937, which for most industries introduced a minimum wage of 110 and 115 rubles per month. See also Schwartz, 165, page 165, and footnote. By causing a drop in the wages of those who could not achieve the new norms, as was the case for numerous workers, the Stakhanovite movement helped to increase wage inequalities. By causing a drop in the wages of those who could not achieve the new norms, as was the case for numerous workers, the Stakhanovite movement helped to increase wage inequalities. However, the growth of these inequalities was far from solely attributable to the influence of Stakhanovism. For example, from 1934, the growth of such inequalities was already noticeable, as can be seen from the quoted figures and the statistical analyses of A. Bergson. Comparing 1928 and 1934 wages and the distribution by level of income of Soviet and American wages, A. Bergson concluded that, so far as wage inequalities are concerned, capitalist principles were stronger in the USSR. Footnote. See A. Bergson's book, The Structure of Soviet Wages, published in 1954. In 1934, wage inequalities could still appear as, quote, nominal, end quote, because numerous products were rationed. It was different after 1935, when rationing was abolished. At that time, prices and wages simultaneously rose, but the wage increase benefited the higher paid more than the lower paid. Two more things should be said about the wage system. 1. First, it will be noticed that each People's Commissariat established its own list defining the nature of different jobs and indicating the places they occupied in the wage scale. This list specified the, quote, qualifications, end quote, required to take a given job. 2. Secondly, decisions about the allocation of workers to jobs were taken by heads of workshops or foremen. This practice was confirmed by a decision of the Central Committee and Sovnarkom of May 27, 1940. This decision strengthened the power of these instruments in management, who also had to check and observe wage rates and work norms to, quote, improve technique, end quote, and take, quote, rationalization measures, end quote. The procedures for fixing wages illustrates a clearly important aspect of the development of capitalist relationships within state enterprises. A more complete appreciation of the development of these relationships during the 1930s requires, however, that there be taken equally into account the evolution of the intensity and productivity of labor. New section, Section D, the evolution of wages. The complexity and scale of questions raised by an analysis of the evolution of wages during the 1930s means that only one general view may be taken of this evolution, covering only the real average wage. The complexity and scale of questions raised by an analysis of the evolution of wages during the 1930s means that only one general view may be taken of this evolution, covering only the real average wage. Footnote: we shall therefore not examine here the development of nominal wages, for the development of nominal wages has hardly any significance from the point of view of the workers' living conditions at a time of fast rising prices. It should be emphasized that the calculation of changes in the real wages is made a little uncertain by the absence of an official index permitting a tracing of variations in the cost of living. There is not even a roughly approximate index of any significance. However, published information about price movements equals an estimate of the order of magnitude of price fluctuations, and consequently can lead to estimates about the development of real wages. End footnote. In fact, because of the growth of wage inequalities, the figures quoted underestimate the decline of the average wage of workers at the bottom of the wage scale. These workers constituted a majority of the working class. At the same time, these figures obscure the growth of real wages, benefiting those at the summit of the income pyramid. Footnote: it will also be noted that during the 1930s, high wages were much less taxed than in the 1920s. Thus, in 1928, income tax is very progressive, from 0.6% to 30%, In 1934, the tax ceiling was 3.5%. On this point, see A. Bergson, The Structure of Soviet Wages. In the next volume, we shall return to this problem, to the measures which mainly favor the differentiation of incomes between workers and managers. End footnote. The years 1928 and 1933 witnessed severe drops in real average wages. In fact, these years were characterized by very grave shortages of numerous products, and retail prices rose much faster than the nominal average wage. Retail price increases can be estimated only roughly because retail prices varied substantially between the different supply sources, state trade, cooperative trade, or, quote, free market, end quote, end parenthesis. Taking into account only the first two categories, state trade and cooperative trade, although the amounts obtainable from them were insufficient, end parenthesis, the average wage in 1932 had fallen by about 11 to 12% compared to 1928. Authors who have tried to take into account the evolution of retail prices other than official prices and of the need to obtain supplies at such prices arrive at the drop considerably greater than that of the real average wage, on the order of 50%. Authors who have tried to take into account the evolution of retail prices other than official prices and of the need to obtain supplies at such prices arrive at the drop considerably greater than that of the real average wage, on the order of 50%. Footnote: see N. Jasny, The Soviet Economy During the Plan Era, published in 1951, page 59. The calculations of E. Zaleski show an even stronger reduction in the wages of industrial workers and employees. According to various Soviet sources used by that author, the nominal wages of workers on average grew by 68.7% between 1927 to 28 and 1932, whilst the price index calculated by him with an allowance for supplies bought on the free market, increased in the same period by 271%. Thus, Zaleski obtains, for 1932, an average wage for workers and employees of industry that is equal to only 45.5% of that of 1927 to 28. End footnote. Nevertheless, it seems that this presents a somewhat too dark picture of the fall experienced in 1932 by the real consumption of the working class. Footnote. In fact, a fraction of the latter benefited from food rations larger than average. Also, some factories organized canteens which provided quite cheap meals. Finally, many workers had gardens which provided part of their food supply. End footnote. The fall registered between 1928 and 1932 for the average real wage was obviously in complete contradiction to the forecasts of the 5-year plan. Footnote. According to the first 5-year plan, the real wage in industry was to increase by nearly 60% in the optimal variant. End footnote. Nothing was said about this at the official report of the results of this plan. In the report on the plan that he presented on the 7th of January, 1933, to the plenum of the CC, Stalin claimed that the, quote, average annual wage of workers and employees in large-scale industry has grown by 67% compared to 1928, end quote. Stalin. Which was only true for the nominal wage. The 1933 average real wage again fell. This was the year when the food supply crisis was most grave. It is not possible to put forward a statistically based evaluation of this new fall, for no meaningful figure is available covering the evolution of prices in the state and cooperative sectors. However, it may be said that agricultural prices on the free (kolkhoz) and market then grew by 48%, whilst the average nominal wage grew by only 9.7%. In 1934, the average real wage was still below that of 1932, although it is impossible to put a figure on it. Footnote. According to S.N. Prokopovich in Russland's Volkswirtschaft unter den Sowjets, published in Zurich in 1944, the workers' average real wage fell by about 30% between 1932 and 1934. End footnote. Rationing is entirely abolished in October 1935, and state and cooperative trade prices were increased. The increase of state and cooperative trade prices affected above all the workers, for whom purchases made in the framework of rationing have been a main source of food supply. This increase in the state and cooperative trade prices affected above all the workers for whom purchases made in the framework of rationing have been a main source of food supply. The extreme variety of prices which were typical of 1934 makes impossible a statistically based evaluation of the change in the real average wage. Footnote. At the same time as rationing was abolished, the price of products henceforth to be sold without, quote, coupons, unquote, rose on average 5 times above the prices of the same products previously sold against ration coupons. Bracket C. Schwartz, C. Schwartz 162, end bracket. In 1937, it can be estimated the average real wage of workers and employees was about 56 to 60% of the 1928 level, parenthesis, or the 1927 to 28 level, end parenthesis, which was an improvement of about 20% compared to 1932. This was far from the, quote, targets, end quote, of the second five-year plan of 1933 to 37, which, quote, forecast, end quote, a doubling of the real average wage in industry. Judging from the price and wage statistics, the real average wage grew in 1938 and 1939. In fact, shortages returned, as did the black market. So it is probable that the real average wage did not, in fact, increase in those 2 years. In 1940, even ignoring the shortages, the real wage was about 10% lower than in 1937. Footnote: Schwartz. Sorry, there's actually a number of footnotes here. E. Zaleski suggests the figure of 56.1%. M. Jasny ends up with 57.6%. And J. Chapman 58%. Bracket C. J. Chapman, Real Wages in Soviet Russia Since 1928. Published in 1963. End footnote. Footnote: C. Schwartz, C. Schwartz, page 169. See Alec Nova, An Economic History of the Soviet Union. I might have to reread a couple sentences. In 1937, it can be estimated the average real wage of workers and employees was about 56 to 60% of the 1928 level, parenthesis, or the 1927 to 28 level, in parenthesis, which is an improvement of about 20% compared to 1932. This was far from the, quote, targets, end quote, of the second five-year plan, parenthesis, 1933 to 37, end parenthesis, which, quote, forecast, end quote, a doubling on the real average wage in industry. Judging from the price and wage statistics, the real average wage grew in 1938 and 1939. In fact, shortages returned, as did the black market. So it is probable that the real average wage did not, in fact, increase in those 2 years. In 1940, even ignoring the shortages, the real wage is about 10% lower than in 1937. The third five-year plan of 1938 to 42, which, quote, forecast, end quote, an increase of 35% for real wages, was no more, quote, achieved, end quote, in this field than it had been in the previous plans. Footnote: see Molotov's report to the Eighth Party Congress. In Correspondance Internationale, April 11, 1939. Finally, in 1940, the real average wage of industrial workers and employees was about 52 to 57% that of 1928. Many other indices of the material situation of urban workers make equally clear a substantial decline in the living conditions of urban workers. Thus, the number of square meters of accommodation available per town inhabitant fell from 6.1 to 4.2 between 1927 and 1928 and 1937. However, the situation of the workers, especially manual workers, was much worse than these figures suggest. For example, in Moscow, while 6% of, quote, tenants, end quote, parenthesis, that is, quote, households, end quote, of one or more person, end parenthesis, had more than one room, 40% had only one room, 23.6% occupied part of a room, parenthesis, or as the term was at the time, a, quote, corner, end quote, in parenthesis, 5% lived in a corridor or kitchen, and 25% in dormitories, parenthesis, usually wooden barracks, in parenthesis. The situation was just as catastrophic outside the capital. At Smolensk, a report of the party committee and the discussions that followed this report illustrate the disastrous situation of workers accommodated in barracks. The latter were overcrowded and badly maintained. Often water fell from the ceiling, quote, right onto the workers' beds, end quote. Sanitary facilities were practically non-existent. At construction sites, there were neither kitchen nor canteens. A female party member pointed out that many women workers, quote, lived virtually on the streets. Some of them threatened to commit suicide, end quote. And that's from a Smolensk archive quoted by M. Fainsod in a book abbreviated Smolensk, page 322. It should be added that during the first 3 5-year plans, an increasing proportion of workers was deprived of the full benefit of social legislation. In fact, henceforth, the latter was applied without restrictions only to workers who had stayed sufficiently long in the same enterprise and had not been penalized for, quote, unjustified absence, end quote. In addition, places in holiday homes were reserved, and priority was given to cadres and Stakhanovites. Between 1928 and 1937, the real average wage and the social benefits of most workers were in serious decline. And that's an important thing to say because one of the things that people try to, when they're trying to more or less make apologies for Stalinism, will say things to the effect of like, oh, well, you have to take into account not just wages, but like the social wage, right? The social benefits that the state ostensibly gave to the direct producers. So it's important to take into account social benefits and how they relate to the workers. And in this case, Bettelheim is saying there was a reduction in social benefits, not just in wages, but in social benefits as well. The Stakhanovite movement developed on the basis of this decline and on the spread of piece rates and bonuses. For that minority of workers who achieved exceptional output, Stakhanovism was a way of escaping difficult living conditions and even for attaining an exceptional level of consumption. While the real average wage declined by more than 40% between 1928 and 1937, the productivity and intensity of labor increased considerably, and hence there was a substantial rate of exploitation of industrial workers. Footnote: unfortunately, it is impossible to even approximately calculate the evolution of this rate. To simply indicate orders of magnitude, the following figures can be quoted. In 1928, the national income in 1926 to 27 prices is estimated to have been 25 billion rubles. See Charles Bettelheim, La Planification, page 268. If it is accepted that the share of industry in this sum was 29.2%, bracket E.H. Carr and R.W. Davies, Foundations of a Planned Economy, 1926 to 29, Volume 1, the net production of industry can then be estimated at 7.3 billion rubles, bracket industrial prices having varied little between 1926 and 27 and 1928, there is little point in making an adjustment for price changes. End bracket. In 1928, industry employed 3.7 million workers. Bracket O.R. Hodgman, Soviet Industrial Production 1928 to 1951, published in 1954. Unemployment in small-scale industry can be estimated at 700,000. Where am I? Bracket Carr and Davies, page 385, note 4, in bracket, which totals 4.4 million workers, giving a net value of industrial production per worker of 1,660 rubles. This same year, the average wage in reported industry was 70.9 rubles monthly, or about 850 rubles per year. Bracket a slightly overestimated average because wages in small-scale industry were smaller, end bracket. These figures reveal a, quote, excess, end quote, of 810 rubles of average value produced per worker over the annual wage. From this, a, quote, index of the rate of surplus value, end quote, can be deduced, 95% in 1928. In 1937, annual labor productivity had advanced by 55% over 1928, bracket, according to the productivity index as revised by Hodgman, page 113, end bracket. If this figure is retained, bracket, because the official index, which shows an advance of 146%, is clearly not usable for reasons that are too long to give here, end bracket. The net value of industrial production per worker is 2,570 rubles in 1927 to 28 prices, bracket, making the hypothesis that net value and gross value of production have moved at approximately the same rhythm, which no doubt is optimistic, but compensated more or less for a possible underestimation of the advance of productivity in the revised index, in bracket. Admitting that the real 1937 wage is 60% of that of 1928, this shows a, quote, excess, end quote, of more than 2,000 rubles of the average value produced per worker over the annual wage, bracket, all in 1927 to 28 prices, in bracket. Hence a, quote, index of the rate of surplus value, end quote, of the order of 400%, quadrupling in comparison with 1928. Obviously, all this is a very approximate estimation, but it seems impossible to suggest anything better. End footnote. The general development of the 1930s, a development characterized by a substantial lowering of wages, a sharp rise in the rate of exploitation, and a decline of living conditions, raises numerous social, ideological, and political problems. Briefly, these problems are of two types. 1. What were the social and political forces which inflicted such defeats on the Soviet workers? 2. How were these defeats inflicted? For the moment, we will concentrate our attention on this last question. How are these defeats inflicted? And we'll reserve the fourth volume of this work for an attempt to answer the first. What were the social and political forces which inflicted such defeats on the Soviet workers? Okay, so that's the end of section 4 of chapter 2 of part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, third period, 1930 to 1941, part 1, The Dominated. And again, part 2 of the book is titled The Militarized Working Class. Chapter 2 of part 2 is titled Extension of the Wage Earning Class and the rigidifying of factory despotism. And section 4 was titled Let's get back to the beginning of this section. Transformation of the wage and norm fixing principles and some effects of this transformation. Thank you so much for listening.